The fire crackled in the darkness as the old man stared into the flames. Around him sat his tribe, their faces glowing orange in the flickering light. The day had been long and hard. They had hunted mammoth across the frozen plains, and now they rested in their cave home. But something troubled the old man tonight. Earlier that day, his brother had died from wounds received in the hunt. The old man looked at his brother's still body lying nearby. Just hours ago, this same body had been running, laughing, speaking. Now it lay cold and silent. What had changed? What had left his brother's body when he died? The old man touched his own chest and felt his heart beating. Something was alive inside him, something that made him different from the rocks and trees around him. This was perhaps the first time a human being wondered about the soul. It happened thousands of years ago when people lived in caves and used stone tools. But the question that troubled that ancient man still troubles us today. What makes us alive? What makes us human? What is the soul? As the centuries passed, this question grew stronger in human minds. When people began to build cities and create writing, they wrote about the soul. When they built temples and crowned kings, they spoke of the soul. When they studied the stars and counted the seasons, they searched for the soul. The soul became the greatest mystery of human life. People wanted to know where it came from, what it looked like, and where it went when they died. They wanted to understand if animals had souls too. They wondered if the soul lived forever, or if it died with the body. Different groups of people, in different parts of the world, came up with different answers. Some said the soul was like breath that entered the body at birth and left at death. Others believed the soul was a tiny person living inside the larger person. Some thought each person had many souls, while others believed in just one. In the hot deserts of Egypt, priests built great pyramids and filled them with treasures. They believed the soul needed these treasures for a long journey after death. They thought the soul would travel through a dark underworld full of dangers and monsters. To help the soul on this journey, they wrote special books with maps and magic spells. The Egyptian priests said people had not just one soul but several different souls. One soul was like a person's shadow, another was like their personality, a third was their life force. When someone died, these souls had to find each other again in the afterlife. This is why the Egyptians took such care to preserve dead bodies as mummies. They believed the soul needed its body to be whole in the next world. Far away in India, wise men sat under trees and thought deeply about the soul. They came to believe that the soul was eternal and divine. They taught that the soul never really died, but moved from one body to another like a person changing clothes. If you lived a good life, your soul would move to a better body. If you lived badly, your soul might become an animal or suffer in some other way. These Indian teachers said the soul was actually part of a great universal spirit, like drops of water that seem separate but are really all part of the same ocean. Individual souls were really part of one great soul that filled everything. The goal of life was to realize this truth and reunite with the universal spirit. In China, philosophers had yet another view of the soul. They believed each person had two souls instead of one. The first soul was light and airy, connected to thoughts and dreams. The second soul was heavy and earthbound, connected to the body and physical life. When a person died, the light soul went to heaven, while the heavy soul stayed near the body and the earth. The Chinese also believed that the souls of dead ancestors could help or harm their living descendants. Families built shrines to their ancestors and offered them food and prayers. They thought that keeping the ancestors happy would bring good fortune to the family. Across the Mediterranean Sea, Greek thinkers were developing their own ideas about the soul. At first, they believed the soul was like a ghost or shadow that lived in a gloomy underworld after death. But as time went on, Greek philosophers began to see the soul as something much more important. A famous Greek teacher named Socrates believed the soul was the most important part of a person. He said the soul was immortal and contained a person's ability to think and make moral choices. Socrates was so sure about this that he willingly drank poison rather than give up his beliefs about the soul. Socrates had a student named Plato who developed these ideas further. Plato taught that the soul had three parts. The first part was reason, which helped people think clearly. The second part was spirit, which gave people courage and determination. The third part was appetite, which included all physical desires and needs. Plato believed these three parts had to work together in harmony for a person to be truly happy. The Hebrew people who lived in the hills between Egypt and Mesopotamia had their own understanding of the soul. They believed that God had breathed life into the first human being, giving him a living soul. For the Hebrews, the soul was the breath of life that came directly from God. This made every human soul precious and sacred. Hebrew teachers emphasized that the soul had moral responsibilities. They believed God would judge each soul based on how well it followed divine commands. The soul was not just about thinking or feeling, but about choosing between right and wrong. As these different cultures met and traded with each other, their ideas about the soul began to mix and change. Greek merchants brought their philosophy to Egypt. Indian ideas spread to China through traveling monks. Hebrew beliefs influenced both Greeks and Romans. The Romans, who built a great empire around the Mediterranean, were especially good at combining different ideas. They took Greek philosophy and made it more practical. They adopted religious ideas from many cultures and tried to make them work together. All of these ancient peoples shared one important belief. They all thought the soul was real and important. They might disagree about what the soul looked like or where it went after death, but they all believed it existed. They all thought the soul was what made humans special and different from other animals. These ancient ideas about the soul did not disappear when those civilizations ended. Instead, they became the foundation for all later thinking about human nature, consciousness, and the meaning of life. Modern psychologists, neuroscientists, and philosophers still wrestle with many of the same questions that troubled that ancient man staring into the fire thousands of years ago. The search for the soul continues today, using new tools and methods, but asking the same basic questions. What makes us human? What is consciousness? Do we have free will? What happens when we die? The ancient quest to understand the soul remains one of humanity's greatest and most enduring adventures. The morning sun cast long shadows across the sandy ground as Imhotep walked toward the Great Pyramid. He was the high priest of Memphis, one of the most important cities in ancient Egypt. The year was 2650 BCE, and Imhotep had been chosen by the pharaoh himself to solve the greatest mystery of human existence. The pharaoh wanted to know what happened to the soul after death. Imhotep was not just a priest. He was also a doctor, an architect, and a wise man who could read the ancient scrolls. People came from far away to ask him questions about life and death. But this question from the pharaoh was different. It was not just about one person's soul, but about the souls of all Egyptian people. As Imhotep climbed the stone steps of the temple, he thought about what he had learned from the old priests. They had taught him that every person had not just one soul, but many different souls. This was very different from what other peoples believed. The Egyptians had spent hundreds of years thinking about this, and they had come up with a complex system. The first soul was called the Ka. Imhotep touched his chest as he thought about the Ka. This was the life force that lived inside every person. It was like a person's double or twin spirit. The Ka was created at the same time as the person's body, and it needed food and drink to survive. When someone died, their Ka continued to exist, but it needed the family to bring offerings of bread, beer, and meat to the tomb. The second soul was called the Ba. This was harder to understand than the Ka. The Ba was like a person's personality. It's their individual character that made them different from everyone else. The priests often drew pictures of the Ba as a bird with a human head. They believed the Ba could fly out of the tomb during the day and visit the places the person had loved in life. But at night, the Ba had to return to the body in the tomb. The third soul was called the Ak. This was the most mysterious of all. The Ak was what a person became when they successfully joined the Ka and Ba together in the afterlife. If this happened, the person would become a shining spirit that could live forever with the gods. But if it failed to happen, the person would truly die and disappear forever. Imhotep had spent years studying these three souls. He had watched people die and had tried to help their souls make the dangerous journey to the afterlife. This journey was not easy. The Egyptian priests believed that after death, the soul had to travel through a dark and frightening place called the Duat. The Duat was like a huge underground world full of rivers, lakes, and caves. Dangerous creatures lived there, including giant serpents and demons with sharp teeth. The soul had to know the right spells and passwords to get past these creatures. It also had to pass through 12 gates, each guarded by powerful spirits. The most frightening part of the journey came when the soul reached the Hall of Two Truths. Here, the god Anubis would weigh the person's heart against a feather. The feather belonged to Maat, the goddess of truth and justice. If the person had lived a good life, their heart would be lighter than the feather. But if they had done evil things, their heart would be heavy, and a monster would eat it. Imhotep knew that preparing for this journey was the most important work he could do. This is why the Egyptians spent so much time and money on their tombs and mummies. They believed the soul needed its body to be preserved forever. Without the body, the Ka and Ba could not come together to form the Ak. The process of making a mummy took 70 days. First, the priests removed the brain through the nose using long metal hooks. Then they took out most of the other organs, except the heart, which they believed was needed for the weighing ceremony. They washed the body with wine and spices, then covered it with a special salt called natron for 40 days to dry it out. After the body was dried, the priests wrapped it in hundreds of yards of linen cloth. Between the layers of cloth, they placed magical amulets and charms. Each amulet had a special purpose. Some were meant to protect the body from harm. Others were supposed to help the soul remember important spells. The most important amulet was placed over the heart. This was usually made of green stone and was carved in the shape of a scarab beetle. The priests believed this would help the heart stay light during the weighing ceremony. While the body was being prepared, craftsmen worked on the tomb. Rich people had elaborate tombs cut into rock cliffs or built from stone blocks. The walls were covered with paintings and hieroglyphic writing. These were not just decorations, they were like instruction manuals for the soul's journey through the afterlife. The paintings showed the soul meeting various gods and goddesses. They depicted the weighing of the heart and the dangers of the duat. The hieroglyphic texts contained spells and prayers that the soul would need to recite. If the soul forgot a spell, it could read it from the wall. Poor people could not afford elaborate tombs, but they still tried to help their souls reach the afterlife. They bought small scrolls of papyrus with the most important spells written on them. These scrolls were placed in the mummy wrappings. Later, these collections of spells became known as the Book of the Dead. Imhotep had helped create many of these spells and prayers. It also designed tombs and supervised mummification ceremonies. But his greatest achievement was helping ordinary Egyptians understand that they too could reach the afterlife. Before his time, many people believed that only pharaohs and nobles had souls that could survive death. Imhotep taught that every person, rich or poor, had a Ka, Ba, and the potential to become an Ak. This was a revolutionary idea. It meant that farmers, craftsmen, and servants were just as important in the spiritual world as kings and priests. The influence of Imhotep and other Egyptian priests spread far beyond Egypt. Traders and travelers carried these ideas to other lands. The Greek philosopher Plato learned about Egyptian soul concepts during his travels. Hebrew teachers were influenced by Egyptian beliefs about the afterlife. Even today, many people around the world believe in some form of life after death, partly because of ideas that first developed in ancient Egypt. The Egyptians gave humanity its first systematic way of thinking about the soul's survival after death. They created detailed maps of the afterlife and practical methods for helping souls reach their destination. Most importantly, they taught that the soul was not just a shadow or ghost, but a complex spiritual being worthy of careful study and preparation. Though the Great Pyramids still stand in the desert, the civilization that built them is long gone. The questions that Imhotep and his fellow priests asked about the soul continue to fascinate people today. Their search for understanding death and what lies beyond remains one of humanity's most enduring quests. The sacred fire crackled in the forest clearing as the old sage Yajnavalkya sat cross-legged on a deerskin. Around him, young students had gathered to hear his teachings about the greatest mystery of all existence. The year was 800 BCE, and deep in the forests of ancient India, wise men were discovering truths about the soul that would change human understanding forever. Yajnavalkya was different from other teachers of his time. While most priests focused on rituals and sacrifices to please the gods, he searched for something deeper. He wanted to know what made humans truly alive. What was the real self that existed beyond the body and mind? What was the soul that never died? The forest around them was quiet except for the sound of birds and the gentle wind in the trees. This was the perfect place for deep thinking. Away from the noise of villages and cities, these forest sages could focus their minds on the biggest questions of life. They had been doing this for hundreds of years, passing their discoveries from teacher to student. Vakya looked at his students and began to speak. He told them about a conversation he had once had with a great king named Janaka. The king had asked him the same question that troubled all thinking people. What is the soul? Where does it come from? What happens when we die? The sage had told the king about his greatest discovery. He'd found that every person carried within them a piece of the divine. This piece was called the Atman. It was not just a soul in the way other people understood souls. It was something much more amazing. It was the eternal, unchanging essence of who they really were. Vakya explained that most people lived their whole lives without knowing about their Atman. They thought they were just their bodies, their thoughts, their feelings, and their memories. But all of these things changed constantly. Bodies grew old and died. Thoughts came and went. Feelings rose and fell like waves on the ocean. Even memories faded with time. The Atman was different. It never changed. It was the witness that watched all these changes happen. It was the consciousness that was aware of thoughts without being the thoughts themselves. It was the life force that animated the body without being the body. It was the real self that remained the same from birth to death and beyond. But Vakya had discovered something even more wonderful. He had realized that the Atman was not separate from the great universal spirit that the sages called Brahman. Brahman was the source and foundation of everything that existed. It was pure consciousness, pure being, pure bliss. And amazingly, the Atman and Brahman were the same thing. This was like discovering that a wave was not separate from the ocean, or that a ray of sunlight was not separate from the sun. Every individual soul was actually part of the one great soul that filled the universe. The goal of life was to realize this truth and experience the unity directly. The students found this hard to understand. How could their individual souls be the same as the universal soul? How could they be both separate people and part of one great being at the same time? Vakya smiled and gave them examples from everyday life. He told them to imagine a person sleeping and dreaming. In the dream, the person might see mountains, rivers, other people, and animals. All of these things seemed real and separate in the dream. But when the person woke up, they realized that everything in the dream was actually created by their own mind. The mountains, rivers, and people were all just different forms of the same consciousness. In the same way, Vakya taught, all the separate things in the world were really just different forms of the one universal consciousness. Trees, animals, people, and even gods were all Brahman appearing in different shapes. When a person realized this truth, they would understand that their own Atman was Brahman itself. This realization was called moksha, which meant liberation or freedom. A person who achieved moksha would be free from fear, suffering, and death. They would know that their true self was eternal and could never be harmed. They would feel connected to everything in the universe, because they would know that everything was really one. But reaching this understanding was not easy. It required years of study, meditation, and self-discipline. The sages developed many practices to help people discover their true nature. They taught special breathing exercises, meditation techniques, and ways of living that would purify the mind and body. They also taught about karma, which was the law of cause and effect in the spiritual world. Every action, word, and thought created karma that would affect the person's future. Good actions created good karma and brought happiness. Bad actions created bad karma and brought suffering. The sages believed that the soul went through many lifetimes, moving from one body to another like a person changing clothes. This was called reincarnation. The type of body and life circumstances a soul received depended on the karma it had created in previous lives. A person who lived with wisdom and compassion might be born into a happy family. Someone who was cruel and selfish might be born into difficult circumstances or even as an animal. This cycle of birth, death, and rebirth continued until the soul finally realized its true nature as Brahman. Then it would be free from the cycle forever and merge back into the universal consciousness from which it had never really been separate. These teachings spread throughout India and eventually to other parts of the world. They became the foundation of Hinduism, Buddhism, and other spiritual traditions. The idea that the soul was divine and eternal gave people hope and purpose. It taught them that their lives had meaning and that they could work towards spiritual perfection. The forest sages also influenced how people thought about ethics and morality. If all souls were really one, then harming another person was like harming yourself. This led to teachings about nonviolence, compassion, and service to others. Many of these ideas are still important in modern times. Yanovakya and the other Vedic sages faced many challenges in developing and spreading their teachings. Some people found the ideas too difficult to understand. Others preferred simpler religious practices focused on pleasing gods through rituals and sacrifices. There were also political and social pressures from rulers who wanted to maintain their power. But the sages persisted because they knew they had discovered something precious. They had found a way to understand the soul that gave meaning to life and hope for the future. They had shown that every person carried within them the seed of divinity and the possibility of perfect freedom. The legacy of these ancient Indian teachers continues to influence millions of people today. Their understanding of the soul as eternal, divine, and connected to all existence has inspired spiritual seekers, philosophers, and scientists around the world. The questions they asked and the answers they found remain as relevant now as they were thousands of years ago, in those quiet forest clearings where wisdom was born. The autumn wind rustled through the bamboo forest as Master Kong walked slowly along the mountain path. His students followed behind him, carrying scrolls and writing brushes. The year was 500 BCE, and this teacher, would later be known as Confucius, was thinking deeply about the nature of the human soul. But his ideas were very different from those of the Egyptian priests or the Indian forest sages. Master Kang had grown up in a time of war and chaos. The great Zhou dynasty was falling apart, and local warlords fought constantly for power. People had lost respect for traditions and moral values. In this troubled world, Master Kang wanted to find a way to bring peace and order back to society. He believed the answer lay in understanding the soul and its connection to family, society, and the natural world. As they walked, one of his students asked him about death. The young man's grandfather had died recently, and the family was preparing for the funeral. The student wanted to know what happened to his grandfather's soul. Would it live on somehow, or was it gone forever? Master Kung paused and looked at the student with kind eyes. He told him that Chinese wise men had been thinking about this question for many centuries. They had discovered that each person actually had two souls, not just one. These two souls worked together during life, but separated at death. The first soul was called Hun. This was the light, airy soul that was connected to thoughts, dreams, and the spiritual side of life. The Hun was like a person's intelligence and consciousness. It was the part of them that could think about beauty, justice, and the meaning of life. When someone died, the Hun rose up toward heaven to join the spirits of the ancestors. The second soul was called Po. This was the heavier, earthbound soul that was connected to the body and physical life. The Po controlled breathing, heartbeat, and all the body's functions. It was also connected to emotions and instincts. When someone died, the Po stayed near the body and gradually returned to the earth. Master Kang explained that understanding these two souls was important for living a good life. A wise person had to keep both souls in balance. If the Hun became too strong, a person might become lost in dreams and forget about their duties to family and society. If the Po became too strong, a person might become too focused on physical pleasures and forget about higher values. The teacher told his students that the best way to keep the souls in balance was through ritual and proper behavior. This was very different from the Indian idea of escaping the world through meditation. Master Kong believed people should fully engage with the world, but do so in the right way. He taught that every person had 5 basic relationships that shaped their soul. These were the relationships between ruler and subject, father and son, husband and wife, older and younger siblings, and friend. Each relationship had specific duties and behaviors that helped develop the soul's character. The most important relationship was between parents and children. Master Kong taught that honoring one's parents and ancestors was the foundation of all morality. This was called filial piety, and it was considered the highest virtue. Children should obey their parents, care for them in old age, and continue to honor them after death. This teaching about ancestor honor was closely connected to Chinese beliefs about the Hun soul. When parents died, their Hun souls did not disappear, but became ancestor spirits that could help or harm their descendants. Families built shrines in their homes where they offered food, wine, and prayers to these ancestor spirits. The ancestor spirits were believed to have power over the family's fortune. If the family honored them properly, the ancestors would bring good luck, health, and prosperity. If the family neglected them, the ancestors might become angry and cause illness, crop failures, or other misfortunes. Master Kang was not the only Chinese teacher thinking about the soul. In the southern mountains, an old sage named Laozi had developed different ideas. While Master Kang focused on social harmony and proper behavior, Laozi emphasized the need to live in harmony with the natural world. Laozi taught that the soul was part of the Tao, which was the mysterious force that created and sustained the universe. The Tao was like a great river that flowed through everything. Sometimes it was gentle and quiet, sometimes it was powerful and rushing. The wise person learned to flow with the Tao rather than fighting against it. According to Laozi, the Han soul was naturally connected to the Tao. Problems arose when people tried to force things to happen instead of letting them unfold naturally. This created tension and conflict in both the individual's soul and in society. The solution was to practice Wu Wei, which meant acting without forcing, like water flowing around a rock. These two approaches to understanding the soul created an ongoing debate in Chinese culture. Some people followed Master Kang's emphasis on social duty and proper behavior. Others preferred Laozi's focus on natural harmony and spontaneous action. Many people tried to combine both approaches. Both teachers agreed that the soul was not meant to escape from the world, but to live in harmony with it. This was different from the Indian idea of liberation through realizing the soul's unity with Brahman. The Chinese saw the soul as naturally connected to family, society, and nature, and they believed the goal was to strengthen these connections rather than transcend them. Chinese doctors also developed ideas about the soul that influenced medicine and healing. They believed that illness often came from imbalances between the Han and Po souls. Too much thinking and worry could weaken the Han, while too much physical indulgence could corrupt the Po. Healing required restoring balance through herbs, acupuncture, exercise, and meditation. The Chinese understanding of dual souls also influenced their approach to government and law. Rulers were expected to cultivate their Han souls through education and moral reflection. This would help them make wise decisions that benefited the people. At the same time, they needed to keep their Po souls under control to avoid being corrupted by power and wealth. Over time, these Chinese ideas about the soul spread to other countries in East Asia, Korean and Japanese. Cultures adopted many of these concepts and developed their own variations. The emphasis on ancestor honor, family duty, and social harmony became central features of East Asian civilization. The Chinese approach to the soul was practical and focused on daily life. Rather than seeking mystical experiences or preparing for an afterlife journey, Chinese teachers wanted to help people live better lives in the present world. They believed that understanding the soul's dual nature was the key to personal happiness and social peace. Today, many of these ancient Chinese ideas about the soul continue to influence how people in East Asia think about life, death, and human nature. The emphasis on family relationships, respect for ancestors, and living in harmony with nature remains strong in modern Chinese culture. The wisdom of Master Kang and Laozi continues to guide people in their search for meaning and purpose. The marketplace of Athens buzzed with activity as Socrates walked among the crowd. Merchants sold olives and pottery, politicians gave speeches, and young men practiced their rhetoric. But the old philosopher was not interested in buying or selling. He was hunting for something much more precious than gold or silver. He was searching for truth about the human soul. It was the year 399 BCE, and Socrates was about to face the greatest test of his life. The citizens of Athens had accused him of corrupting the youth and denying the gods. Tomorrow he would stand trial, and if found guilty, he might face death. But Socrates was not afraid. He believed that understanding the soul had taught him something that made death powerless to harm him. Socrates stopped beside a young man named Plato, who would later become his most famous student. The old teacher's eyes sparkled with the same curiosity that had driven him to question people for decades. He began to speak about the soul in a way that was completely different from anything the Greeks had heard before. For hundreds of years, the Greeks had believed that the soul was like a shadow or ghost. When Homer wrote his great poems about heroes like Achilles and Odysseus, He described the souls of dead warriors as pale shades wandering in a gloomy underworld. These souls could barely speak and had no real power or consciousness. Death was the end of everything meaningful about a person. But Socrates had come to believe something revolutionary. He taught that the soul was not a weak shadow, but the most important part of a person. It was the part that could think, learn, and make moral choices. Unlike the body, which grew old and died, the soul was immortal and could never be destroyed. This idea changed everything. If the soul was immortal, then death was not the end, but just a transition. The soul would continue to exist after the body died, perhaps moving to a better place if the person had lived a good life. This meant that taking care of the soul was more important than taking care of the body. Socrates believed that the soul's health depended on wisdom and virtue. Ignorant soul was like a sick body, weak and unable to function properly. A wise soul was strong and beautiful, capable of seeing truth and making good decisions. This is why Socrates spent his life trying to help people become wiser by questioning their beliefs and assumptions. The philosopher was famous for saying that he knew nothing except that he knew nothing. This was not false modesty, but a deep understanding of how little any human could truly know. By admitting his ignorance, Socrates could keep learning and growing. He believed this intellectual humility was essential for the soul's development. When Socrates went on trial, he used his beliefs about the soul to defend himself. He told the jury that even if they killed his body, they could not harm his soul. Death might even be a blessing, allowing his soul to continue its search for truth in another realm. He refused to beg for mercy or promise to stop teaching, because that would mean betraying his soul's deepest purpose. The jury found Socrates guilty and sentenced him to death by drinking poison hemlock. His friends begged him to escape from prison, but he refused. He said that breaking the law would harm his soul more than dying would harm his body. On his last day, he drank the poison calmly, continuing to discuss philosophy with his students until the very end. Plato was deeply affected by his teacher's death. He spent the rest of his life developing and expanding Socrates' ideas about the soul. Plato created a detailed theory that described the soul as having 3 distinct parts, each with its own function and characteristics. The first part was reason, which Plato located in the head. This was the soul's ability to think logically, understand abstract concepts, and perceive eternal truths. Reason was like a charioteer trying to control 2 powerful horses. When reason was strong and wise, it could guide the whole person toward truth and goodness. The second part was spirit, which Plato placed in the chest near the heart. This was the source of courage, determination, and noble emotions. Spirit gave people the strength to fight for what was right and to overcome obstacles. But if spirit became too strong, it could make a person aggressive and violent. The third part was appetite, which Plato located in the stomach and lower body. This included all physical desires like hunger, thirst, and sexual attraction. Appetite was necessary for survival, but it could also lead people astray if it became too powerful. A person dominated by appetite would care only about pleasure and comfort. Plato taught that a healthy soul required harmony among these 3 parts. Reason should be the ruler, making wise decisions based on truth and justice. Spirit should be reason's ally, providing the courage needed to carry out good decisions. Appetite should be controlled and directed toward proper goals. This harmony was not easy to achieve. It required education, self-discipline, and constant effort. Plato believed that most people lived with unbalanced souls, dominated by appetite or spirit rather than reason. This led to personal unhappiness and social problems. To help people develop balanced souls, Plato founded a school called the Academy. Students there studied mathematics, philosophy, and other subjects that would strengthen their reason. They also practiced physical exercise and music to develop their spirit in healthy ways. The goal was to create wise and virtuous leaders who could help society. Plato's student Aristotle later developed different ideas about the soul. While Plato saw the soul as separate from and superior to the body, Aristotle believed the soul and body were more closely connected. He described the soul as the form or organizing principle that made a living thing what it was. According to Aristotle, plants had souls that controlled growth and nutrition. Animals had souls that also included sensation and movement. Humans had souls that added the power of reason to these basic functions. This made humans unique among all living things, capable of abstract thinking and moral choice. Aristotle was less certain than Plato about the soul's immortality. He thought that most of the soul died with the body, but he believed that the rational part might continue to exist in some form. This more cautious approach influenced later thinkers, who tried to balance philosophical reasoning with religious beliefs. The Greek Revolution in thinking about the soul had lasting effects far beyond ancient Athens. Their emphasis on reason, virtue, and the soul's immortality became central to later Christian, Islamic, and Jewish philosophy. Their methods of logical argument and systematic investigation became the foundation of Western philosophy and science. The courage that Socrates showed in facing death for his beliefs about the soul inspired countless later thinkers and reformers. His example proved that ideas about the soul were not just abstract theories, but practical guides for how to live and die with dignity and purpose. The shepherd boy David sat on a rocky hill overlooking his flock of sheep. The evening sun painted the hills of Judea golden, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of wildflowers. As he watched his sheep graze peacefully, David thought about the words his grandfather had taught him from the ancient stories. God had formed the first man from the dust of the earth and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. This was the year 1000 BCE. The Hebrew people had a very different understanding of the soul from their neighbors. While the Egyptians spoke of multiple souls and the Greeks debated immortal spirits, the Hebrews believed in something simpler, yet more profound. The soul was the breath of life that came directly from God. David would grow up to become the greatest king of Israel, but even as a young shepherd, he understood that his soul was precious because it came from the Creator of the universe. This was not his own achievement or the result of his family's wealth. Every human being, rich or poor, received their soul as a gift from God. The Hebrew word for soul was nephesh, which meant a living, breathing being. Unlike the Greek idea of the soul as separate from the body, the Hebrews saw the soul as the whole person made alive by God's breath. When God breathed life into the first human, that person became a nephesh, a living soul. The soul was not something that people had, but something they were. This understanding came from their belief that there was only one God who created and ruled everything. Other peoples worshipped many different gods, but the Hebrews believed that their God was the source of all life. This made every human soul sacred because it carried a spark of the divine breath. As David grew older and became king, he faced many challenges that tested his understanding of the soul. He had to make difficult decisions about war and peace, justice and mercy. Sometimes he made mistakes that brought suffering to himself and his people. But through all these experiences, he learned that the soul was not just about individual life, but about moral responsibility. The Hebrew prophets who came after David developed this understanding further. Men like Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel taught that God had given human souls not just to live, but to choose between right and wrong. The soul was the part of a person that could hear God's voice and respond to divine commands. This was very different from other ancient views of the soul. Egyptians focused on preserving the soul for the afterlife. The Indians sought to merge the soul with universal consciousness. The Chinese emphasized harmony between different parts of the soul. But the Hebrews stressed the soul's relationship with God and its moral obligations. The prophet Isaiah walked through the streets of Jerusalem during a time of great crisis. Foreign armies threatened the city, and many people had lost hope. But Isaiah proclaimed that God cared about each individual soul. He taught that the Almighty knew every person by name and had a purpose for their life. Even in the darkest times, people could trust that their souls were safe in God's hands. Isaiah also taught that the soul's relationship with God affected how people treated each other. Because every person was created with a divine soul, hurting another person was a sin against God. This led to strong teachings about justice for the poor, kindness to strangers, and care for those who could not protect themselves. The prophet Jeremiah faced even greater challenges. When the Babylonian army destroyed Jerusalem and carried the Hebrew people into exile, many people wondered if God had abandoned them. Had their souls lost their connection to the divine? Jeremiah gave them hope by teaching that God would make a new covenant with his people. This covenant would be written on their hearts, making their souls more sensitive to divine guidance. Jeremiah also taught about individual responsibility. In earlier times, people believed that children suffered for their parents' sins, But Jeremiah proclaimed that each soul would be judged for its own choices. Parents could not save their children's souls, and children were not condemned by their parents' mistakes. Every person had to choose for themselves whether to follow God's ways. The prophet Ezekiel had a vision that helped explain what happened to the soul after death. He saw a valley full of dry bones that came back to life when God breathed on them. This taught the Hebrew people that death was not the end of the soul's story. God had the power to resurrect the dead and give them new life. This was different from the Greek idea of the soul's natural immortality. The Hebrews believed that souls continued after death, only because God chose to preserve them. Eternal life was not something the soul possessed by nature, but a gift that God gave to those who lived faithfully. The Hebrew understanding of the soul also influenced their worship in daily life. They built the great temple in Jerusalem as a place where people could come to reconnect their souls with God. They established festivals and ceremonies that reminded them of their spiritual identity. They created laws that protected the weak and promoted justice. The wise King Solomon, David's son, wrote many sayings about the soul's relationship with wisdom and foolishness. He taught that a wise soul sought understanding and righteousness, while a foolish soul chased after empty pleasures. The soul's choices determined whether a person's life would be meaningful or wasted. Hebrew teachers also emphasized that the soul needed care and nourishment just like the body. Prayer, study of sacred writings, and acts of kindness fed the soul and kept it healthy. Neglecting these spiritual practices would make the soul weak and vulnerable to temptation. The Hebrew understanding of the soul faced many challenges throughout their history. Other peoples mocked their belief in one God and tried to force them to worship idols. Political leaders sometimes ignored the prophet's teachings about justice and mercy, even among the Hebrew people themselves. Some preferred the elaborate mythologies of their neighbors to the demanding moral teachings of their own tradition. But the Hebrew concept of the soul as God's breath of life survived these challenges and eventually spread throughout the world. Their emphasis on individual moral responsibility, divine judgment, and care for the weak became central to later religious traditions. Their belief that every human soul was precious in God's sight helped establish the foundation for ideas about human rights and dignity. The Hebrew prophets gave humanity a new way of thinking about the soul that emphasized its moral and spiritual dimensions. They taught that the soul was not just about consciousness or immortality, but about relationship with God and responsibility toward others. This understanding continues to influence how millions of people today think about the meaning and purpose of human life. Marcus Tullius Cicero stood in the Roman Senate, his voice echoing off the marble columns as he spoke about the nature of the human soul. It was 63 BCE, and the great orator was defending the Republic against those who would destroy it. But his speech was about more than politics. It was about what made Romans different from barbarians, what gave them the strength to rule the world. Cicero had studied the Greek philosophers during his youth in Athens. He had read Plato's theories about the soul's three parts and Aristotle's ideas about reason and virtue. But as a practical Roman, he wanted to know how these ideas could help people live better lives and build a stronger society. The Romans were not great original thinkers like the Greeks or profound mystics like the Indians, but they had a special talent for taking the best ideas from other cultures and making them work in the real world. They built the greatest empire in history by combining military strength with practical wisdom about human nature. Cicero taught that the soul was indeed immortal, as Plato had claimed, but he was more interested in what this meant for daily life than in abstract philosophical debates. If the soul survived death, then people had good reasons to live virtuously. They would be judged in the afterlife based on their actions in this world. The Roman understanding of the soul emphasized duty and service to the state. While the Greeks focused on individual wisdom and the Indians sought personal liberation, the Romans believed the soul's highest purpose was to serve the common good. A noble Roman should be willing to sacrifice personal comfort and even life itself for the benefit of Rome. This idea was embodied in the story of Lucius Junius Brutus, the founder of the Roman Republic. When his own sons conspired to restore the monarchy, Brutus ordered their execution. He loved them as a father, but his duty to Rome was more important than his personal feelings. This showed that a truly great soul could rise above private emotions to serve higher principles. The Romans also developed practical methods for training the soul, Young Romans studied rhetoric, which taught them how to speak persuasively and think clearly about complex problems. They practiced military exercises that built courage and discipline. They studied law and history to understand their duties as citizens. The Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who ruled from 161 to 180 CE, became one of Rome's greatest teachers about the soul. He was heavily influenced by the Stoic philosophy that had developed in Greece, but gave it a distinctly Roman character. Marcus Aurelius wrote his thoughts about the soul in a personal journal that later became known as the Meditations. Marcus Aurelius taught that the soul was a small part of the universal reason that governed the cosmos. Like the Indian concept of Atman and Brahman, this suggested that individual souls were connected to something larger than themselves. But the Roman emperor was more concerned with practical implications than metaphysical speculation. He believed that understanding the soul's connection to universal reason should make people more accepting of their fate. If everything happened according to divine plan, then complaining about hardships was pointless. The wise person learned to focus on what they could control, their own thoughts and actions, rather than worrying about external circumstances. This Stoic approach to the soul emphasized emotional self-control and rational thinking. A well-trained soul would not be disturbed by pain, loss, or criticism. It would remain calm and focused on duty regardless of external pressures. This made Stoicism very popular among Roman soldiers and administrators who faced constant challenges. The Roman approach to the soul also influenced their religious practices. They were tolerant of different beliefs and often adopted gods and ceremonies from conquered peoples. They saw religious ritual as a way to maintain harmony between human souls and divine powers. As long as people performed their civic duties, they were free to worship as they chose. This practical tolerance allowed many different ideas about the soul to coexist within the Roman Empire. Egyptian mystery religions promised personal immortality through elaborate initiation ceremonies. Persian Mithraism appealed to soldiers with its emphasis on courage and brotherhood. Greek philosophical schools continued to debate abstract questions about consciousness and reality. The Romans themselves contributed new ideas about the legal and political dimensions of the soul. They developed the concept of natural law, which held that certain rights and duties came from human nature itself, rather than from particular cultures or rulers. This suggested that all souls, regardless of nationality or social class, shared certain fundamental characteristics. Roman lawyers also worked out detailed rules about how the soul's moral responsibility related to legal punishment. They distinguished between crimes committed intentionally and those done by accident. They considered whether a person's mental state affected their guilt or innocence. These legal principles influenced how later civilizations thought about the relationship between the soul and society. The Roman approach to the soul faced serious challenges as the empire grew larger and more diverse. Different peoples had very different ideas about life, death, and moral duty. Maintaining unity became increasingly difficult as traditional Roman values competed with foreign philosophies and religions. The greatest challenge came from Christianity, which offered a very different understanding of the soul's relationship with the divine. Early Christians taught that salvation came through faith in Jesus, rather than through virtuous actions or philosophical wisdom. This appealed to many people who found Stoic self-reliance too demanding or Greek intellectualism too abstract. The Roman Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity in 312 CE, fundamentally changing how the empire understood the soul. Instead of seeking harmony with cosmic reason or serving the state, Christians were called to love God and their neighbors. This shift marked the end of the classical Roman approach to the soul and the beginning of a new era. Despite these changes, Roman ideas about the soul continued to influence Western civilization. The emphasis on duty, law, and practical virtue became central to European culture. The Stoic ideal of emotional self-control influenced everything from military training to business ethics. The Roman synthesis of different philosophical traditions provided a model for later attempts to combine reason and faith. Roman writers like Cicero and Marcus Aurelius also created a literary tradition that made philosophical ideas about the soul accessible to ordinary people. Instead of writing abstract treatises for scholars, they produced speeches, letters, and personal reflections that showed how soul concepts applied to real-life situations. The Roman contribution to understanding the soul was not primarily theoretical, but practical. They showed how ideas about consciousness, morality, and immortality could be used to build stronger individuals and better societies. They demonstrated that thinking about the soul was not just an intellectual exercise, but a necessary foundation for effective leadership and good citizenship. The legacy of Roman soul concepts can still be seen today in legal systems that emphasize individual responsibility, educational programs that stress character development, and political philosophies that balance personal freedom with civic duty. The Roman genius for practical wisdom continues to influence how people think about the soul's role in creating just and prosperous societies. Augustine sat in his garden in the North African city of Hippo, tears streaming down his face as he heard a child's voice singing in the distance. The year was 386 CE, and this brilliant young teacher was experiencing the most important moment of his life. For years he had searched for truth about the human soul, studying Greek philosophy and experimenting with different religions. Now, suddenly everything was becoming clear. The voice seemed to be saying, "Take and read." So Augustine picked up a scroll containing letters from the Apostle Paul. As he read about the transformation that faith could bring to the human soul, Augustine felt his own soul being changed. This moment would not only reshape his personal life, but would influence how Christians understood the soul for the next 1,000 years. Augustine had grown up in a world where many different ideas about the soul competed for attention. The old Roman gods still had followers, Greek philosophers continued their debates, and mystery religions promised secret knowledge about life after death. But something new was spreading through the empire. Christians claimed that Jesus of Nazareth had revealed the truth about the soul's relationship with God. The early Christians built on Hebrew teachings about the soul as God's breath of life, but they added revolutionary new elements. They taught that God himself had become human in the person of Jesus. This meant that human souls were so valuable to God that he was willing to die to save them from sin and eternal death. This was very different from other ancient ideas about the soul. The Greeks believed souls could achieve immortality through wisdom and virtue. The Indians taught that souls could escape suffering by realizing their unity with universal consciousness. The Romans emphasized the soul's duty to serve the state and accept whatever fate the gods decreed. But Christians proclaimed that souls were helpless to save themselves. No amount of philosophical wisdom, mystical experience, or virtuous action could bridge the gap between human sinfulness and divine holiness. Salvation was a free gift that God offered to anyone who believed in Jesus, regardless of their education, social status, or moral achievements. Augustine struggled with this teaching because his philosophical training emphasized human reason and free will. He had studied Plato's ideas about the soul's natural immortality and had been attracted to Manichaeism, a religion that taught people could achieve salvation through special knowledge. But his personal experience convinced him that the Christian message was true. Before his conversion, Augustine had lived a life focused on worldly success and pleasure. He was a talented teacher of rhetoric who enjoyed wine, women, and intellectual debates. But he found that these things did not satisfy his soul's deepest longings. Even his study of philosophy left him feeling empty and confused. The turning point came when Augustine realized that his soul was corrupted by what Christians called original sin. This was the idea that all human souls were damaged by the first human's disobedience to God. Because of this corruption, people naturally chose selfishness over love, pride over humility, and temporary pleasures over eternal truths. This understanding of the soul's fallen condition was one of Christianity's most distinctive contributions to human thought. Other ancient traditions generally assumed that souls were basically good and needed only proper education or spiritual practices to reach their potential. But Christians taught that souls required divine intervention to be healed and restored. Augustine developed these ideas into a comprehensive theology that explained how God's grace worked to transform sinful souls. He taught that God chose certain people to receive salvation not because they deserved it, but simply because of divine love and mercy. This grace gave them new hearts that could love God and neighbor, instead of being focused only on themselves. This transformation was not just about the afterlife, but changed how people lived in the present world. Augustine's own life demonstrated this change. After his conversion, he gave up his career as a teacher and his plans for marriage. He became a priest and eventually a bishop, dedicating his life to serving God and helping other souls find salvation. Augustine also wrote extensively about his spiritual journey in a book called the Confessions. This was one of the first autobiographies ever written, and it showed how Christian ideas about the soul could help people understand their own inner experiences. Augustine described his childhood, his education, his moral struggles, and his eventual conversion with remarkable honesty and insight. The Confessions revealed how complex the human soul really was. Augustine showed that people often wanted to do good, but found themselves choosing evil instead. They knew that certain things were wrong, but felt powerless to resist temptation. This psychological realism made Christian teaching appealing to people who recognized these conflicts in their own lives. Augustine also had to defend Christian beliefs about the soul against critics and competing ideas. Some people influenced by Greek philosophy claimed that matter was evil and only spirit was good. This led them to deny that Jesus could have had a real human body, or that physical resurrection was possible. Augustine argued that God had created both matter and spirit as good. The problem was not that souls were trapped in evil bodies, but that sin had corrupted the whole person. Salvation involved the restoration of both soul and body, which is why Christians believed in resurrection, rather than just the soul's immortality. Other critics argued that if God predetermined who would be saved, then human choices and moral efforts were meaningless. Augustine responded that God's grace did not eliminate human responsibility, but made it possible for people to choose good instead of always choosing evil. The soul was genuinely free when it was liberated from sin's power. The Christian transformation of ancient ideas about the soul faced enormous challenges during Augustine's lifetime. The Roman Empire was collapsing under pressure from barbarian invasions. Many people blamed Christianity for weakening traditional Roman virtues and making the empire vulnerable to attack. Augustine responded by writing a massive work called The City of God. He argued that earthly kingdoms rise and fall, but the souls of believers belong to an eternal kingdom that cannot be destroyed. This gave Christians hope during dark times, and helped them maintain their faith even when their civilization seemed to be ending. The barbarian invasions also forced Christians to think about how their understanding of the soul related to different cultures. As Germanic tribes converted to Christianity, they brought their own traditions and ways of thinking. Christian teachers had to find ways to communicate soul concepts using new languages and cultural frameworks. Augustine's synthesis of Christian theology with Greek philosophy became the foundation for medieval Christian thought. His ideas about the soul's relationship to God, the nature of sin and grace, and the meaning of human history influenced theologians for centuries. Even today, many Christians continue to find his insights helpful for understanding their spiritual lives. The early Christian transformation of ancient soul concepts was revolutionary because it emphasized God's love for individual souls rather than cosmic principles or social duties. It taught that every person's soul was precious enough for God to sacrifice his own Son. It promised that even the weakest and most sinful souls could be transformed by divine grace. This message spread throughout the ancient world and eventually replaced most other ways of understanding the soul. It gave people hope that their lives had meaning and purpose, even in difficult circumstances, creating communities united by faith rather than just ethnic or social bonds. It established new standards for how souls should treat each other based on divine love, rather than just human wisdom or power. The Christian understanding of the soul as created, fallen, and redeemed became one of the most influential ideas in human history shaping not only religious thought but also art, literature, law, and social institutions for the next 1,500 years. Dr. Sarah Chen stood in her neuroscience laboratory at Harvard University, staring at the brain scans displayed on her computer screen. The colorful images showed the electrical activity of a human brain during deep meditation. As she studied the patterns of neural firing, she could not help but think about an ancient question that had puzzled humanity for thousands of years. Where in all these neurons and synapses was the soul? It was 2024, and Sarah was part of a new generation of scientists studying consciousness, the modern name for what ancient peoples called the soul. With advanced technology, researchers could now watch the brain work in real time, map its connections, and even stimulate specific areas to change thoughts and emotions, while yet the fundamental mystery remained unsolved. Sarah had grown up hearing stories from her Chinese grandmother about the Hun and Po souls. While attending a Christian church that taught about eternal souls created by God, in college, she had studied Western philosophy and learned about Plato's theories and Aristotle's ideas. Now, as a scientist, she was trying to understand how these ancient insights related to modern discoveries about the brain and mind. The question of the soul had not disappeared with the rise of modern science. Instead, it had transformed into new forms that reflected contemporary knowledge and concerns. Psychologists studied the unconscious mind and discovered that human behavior was influenced by hidden mental processes, much like the ancient idea that souls had depths beyond ordinary awareness. Neuroscientists like Sarah mapped the brain's structure and function, finding that different regions controlled different aspects of consciousness and behavior. This reminded many people of ancient theories like Plato's division of the soul into reason, spirit, and appetite, or the Chinese concept of multiple souls with different functions. Computer scientists created artificial intelligence programs that could think, learn, and even create art and literature. This raised new questions about what made human consciousness special. If machines could simulate mental processes, what was unique about the human soul? Did consciousness require a biological brain, or could it exist in other forms? Philosophers continued to debate whether the mind was separate from the brain or whether consciousness emerged from complex neural activity. Some argued for materialism, the view that everything, including the soul, was made of physical matter. Others defended dualism, the ancient idea that mind and matter were fundamentally different kinds of things. Religious traditions adapted their teachings about the soul to incorporate new scientific knowledge. Some Christians argued that the soul was a non-physical essence that God attached to the developing brain. Some Buddhists suggested that consciousness was a fundamental feature of the universe, present even in simple particles. Some Hindus claim that modern physics supported ancient Vedantic teachings about the unity of all consciousness. The ancient Egyptian emphasis on preserving the soul for the afterlife found new expression in modern cryonics, the practice of freezing dead bodies in hope that future technology could revive them. Some people also explored digital immortality, trying to upload their consciousness to computers so their souls could survive the death of their biological bodies. The Indian concept of the Atman as eternal consciousness influenced modern spiritual movements that combined meditation practices with scientific research. Studies showed that meditation could change brain structure and function, reducing stress and increasing emotional well-being. This seemed to confirm ancient claims about the soul's ability to transcend ordinary limitations through proper training. The Chinese understanding of soul harmony inspired holistic approaches to medicine and psychology that treated the whole person rather than just isolated symptoms. Practices like acupuncture, tai chi, and feng shui gained popularity in Western countries as people sought to balance the different aspects of their souls in ways their ancestors had taught. The Greek emphasis on rational thinking and logical argument became the foundation of modern scientific method. The Socratic practice of questioning assumptions and seeking truth through dialogue influenced how researchers approached the study of consciousness. The Platonic belief in eternal truths inspired mathematicians and physicists, who sought universal laws underlying the physical world. The Hebrew understanding of the soul as morally responsible to God evolved into modern concepts of human rights and dignity. The idea that every person's soul was precious regardless of their social status became the basis for democratic political systems and international laws, protecting individual freedom and equality. The Roman focus on practical virtue and civic duty influenced modern educational systems that tried to develop both intellectual abilities and moral character. The Stoic emphasis on emotional self-control found new applications in cognitive, behavioral therapy, and other psychological treatments that helped people manage their thoughts and feelings. The Christian teaching about the soul's need for divine grace inspired modern movements for social justice and human compassion. Christian hospitals, schools, and charitable organizations reflected the belief that every soul deserved care and respect. The Christian emphasis on confession and forgiveness influenced modern psychotherapy and addiction recovery programs. Despite all these developments, the fundamental questions about the soul remained as mysterious as ever. Scientists could describe how the brain worked, but they could not fully explain why there was any subjective experience at all. They could map consciousness, but could not create it from scratch. It could influence thoughts and emotions, but could not eliminate the sense of being a unique individual self. Sarah Chen represented a new generation of researchers who were trying to bridge the gap between ancient wisdom and modern knowledge. She studied not only Western neuroscience, but also Eastern meditation traditions. She collaborated with philosophers, theologians, and artists to explore consciousness from multiple perspectives. Her research suggested that consciousness might not be located in any single part of the brain, but might emerge from the complex interactions between different neural networks. This reminded her of ancient teachings that described the soul as the organizing principle that unified all aspects of a person's being. Sarah also discovered that people's beliefs about their own souls could actually influence their brain function and behavior. Those who believed they had free will showed different neural patterns from those who believed everything was determined by prior causes. Those who practiced spiritual disciplines developed enhanced abilities for attention and emotional regulation. This suggested that the ancient tradition of soul cultivation was not just philosophical speculation, but practical wisdom about human development, whether people called it soul training, character development, or mindfulness practice. The systematic effort to understand and improve consciousness seemed to produce real benefits. As Sarah looked at her brain scans, she realized that technology alone would never solve the mystery of the soul. The tools of science could reveal important facts about consciousness, but understanding the soul's full significance required the same kind of wisdom that ancient sages had cultivated through centuries of careful observation and reflection. The eternal question about the soul continued to matter because it touched on everything that made human life meaningful. Questions about consciousness led to questions about free will, moral responsibility, personal identity, and the possibility of life after death. These were not just academic puzzles, but practical concerns that affected how people lived their daily lives. Sarah understood that her scientific work was part of humanity's ongoing quest to understand itself. Like the ancient Egyptian priests, Indian sages, Chinese philosophers, Greek thinkers, Hebrew prophets, Roman statesmen, and Christian theologians before her, she was trying to discover what made humans unique and valuable. The search for the soul had evolved from campfire conversations to laboratory experiments. But the underlying human need remained the same. People wanted to know who they really were, why they existed, and what their lives meant. The ancient wisdom traditions offered different answers to these questions, but they all agreed that the quest itself was essential to human flourishing. As long as people wondered about consciousness, identity, and meaning, the eternal question about the soul would continue to inspire new generations of seekers, thinkers, and researchers. The ancient conversation about the soul was far from over. It was just beginning a new chapter in humanity's greatest adventure of self-discovery.